Welcome to all of you to today's book launch event for Comparative Methods in Law, Humanities and Social Sciences. My name is Simon Reed-Henry and I'm the Director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary, University of London. And it's a real pleasure to be hosting a launch for a book which really is one of the first projects that as an institute we engaged in and have followed throughout its progress now to publication just before Christmas. I think it was back in 2017, 2018 that we ran a series of lectures at Queen Mary on the methodology of comparative disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences. And eventually this book, based on those lectures, has emerged and now being published with Edward Elgar. The original lectures were financed by ourselves at the IHSS under the auspices then of Alsamis Mitselegas, and in conjunction, I should note as well, with the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. The book has been edited and overseen by our own Professor Mark van Hoecke and Professor Maurice Adams. Mark is a philosopher and lawyer by training, former rector of the Catholic University of Brussels, now the Brussels campus of Leuven University, and former visiting professor of the European University Institute in Florence. He's also the author of numerous books on law and legal reasoning. Maurice is general professor of jurisprudence at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and his research examines the relation between constitutional law and politics and in comparative legal research methodology. He's also published numerous books on methods and is an elected member of the Académie Internationale de Droit Comparé. Now, this book, Comparative Methods, is a super achievement, and it addresses numerous questions of really enduring relevance to the disciplines. To say just a little about that before I hand over to Mark, and so to try in some small way, I guess, to begin to set the scene for today's discussion. Legal scholarship routinely confronts a number of epistemological challenges relating to context and scope and meaning. But in this context, what does comparing in comparative law actually mean? What methods could or should we use? And moreover, with what consequences? The opening point for this volume is, in a sense, to put these problems into dialogue with other disciplines that also confront the specific challenges of comparative approaches. And this very quickly takes us into questions about the authority of knowledge, about how warrant is secured for particular ways of knowing and particular types of knowing. So what the book seeks to do, in other words, is to contextualize comparative law in light of the insights of a number of other comparative disciplines and their own methodological problems and choices. But if this sounds abstract, it really isn't. Questions of power immediately intrude, and I look forward to discussing some of the practical and perhaps in some senses with a small p political implications of some of these insights. Now I'll let Mark introduce the book properly in a moment, and also introduce our panelists for today who are among the book's contributing authors. But let me just first then extend a warm welcome to you, Mark, to Maurice, to Ralph Weber, to Paula Giliker, and hopefully also, if she's able to join us, to Greta Olson. The format for today is for each of the speakers to say a little about the issue of comparative disciplines from their own disciplinary standpoint. I'll then chair a discussion among the panelists, at which point members of the audience are very welcome to pose your own questions in the chat, and please do that. We'll then throw it open to the floor for a wider discussion amongst all of us here today. One last thing to note from me, and Mark, do correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there's a discount available to those of you in attendance of 35% off the cover price, and the discount code is ADAM35, or you can of course contact Mark directly. So with that then, Mark, let me hand over to you to hear a little bit more about the book, its genesis, and some of the themes that you see coming out of it, and then very much looking forward, as I say, to the contributions of our panelists today and the conversation we'll all be having together. So thank you from me, and a very warm welcome to the IHSS.
Thank you very much, Simon. I plan to say something about the origin of the project. Why did we come to this kind of approach, to this kind of publication? So we, I mean, Maurice and me, we are lawyers. We are comparative lawyers. And we noticed that ever since the birth of the discipline in the 19th century and until now, comparative law has permanently struggled with issues about methodology. Now, we also notice that many other disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences had a sister discipline called comparative sociology, comparative history, and so on. So we were thinking, well, probably these disciplines which are more focusing on methodology than law has been, research methodology, I mean, maybe they have answers to our questions and to our problems. So let's have a look on how they have coped with maybe similar questions. So that was our starting point. First, for the series of lectures you already mentioned, and eventually the publication of the book, which is launched today. And this book contains partly papers issued from the lectures, but also partly additional papers written by colleagues who were not involved in the lecture series before. Now, what was the outcome of the project? Well, of course, I'm not able to say in 2 words what is in the whole book, but what is the outcome in terms of, did we get an answer to our questions? Did we find what we expected to find? Well, of course, we learned a lot from the lectures and from the papers, but basically we had to conclude that all comparative disciplines struggle and struggled and still struggle today to some extent with similar problems. And even at the opposite of comparative law, where there is a clear distinction between legal scholarship within legal systems, within state legal systems on the one hand, and comparative law on the other, we see that in many disciplines there is a debate whether all sociology is not comparative sociology, whether not all history is comparative, so that there is no space for a comparative discipline next to the basic discipline. Especially in the social sciences, the disciplines like sociology and history are often have developed on the basis of national borders. So you have, for French sociology, you have a German sociology studying problems in that country with data collected in that country. And the question is, shouldn't we move beyond the borders, and certainly in an age of globalization? So that means that the whole idea of a comparative discipline is already not obvious as such. Now, what are these common issues which are present in most, or at least several, comparative disciplines? Well, I identify 6 of them, but of course you could structure them otherwise. But that you will also find in the book in several, not every issue will be discussed in every paper, but each of them will be discussed or has been discussed in more than one paper at least. So the first issue is, what is comparing exactly about? What does it mean to compare? It's a typical concept where everybody thinks, well, that's obvious, but when you have a closer look, it's difficult to answer the question. And we notice varying approaches ranging from, for instance, looking for common origins, as in comparative linguistics, where the idea was we look for the original common language from which our current languages have been derived, or simply or just trying to understand foreign cultures, like in anthropology. Anthropology comparing quite different cultures from our original, our own culture, is the main aim of the research and the comparison. The second issue is identifying and respecting local cultural identities on the one hand, and universalist approaches on the other. We see there a tendency in respecting this cultural identity on the one hand, and ideas which are basically influenced by the natural sciences, namely to generalize, to exclude the anecdotic details, and to come to general laws, general rules, general principles, general phenomena, which can be identified well at a larger scale, if not worldwide. And that is one of the debates in the comparative disciplines, that sometimes it's assumed that economic, historical laws, sociological laws should be equally valid all over the world, and that we have to exclude this local specific details to come to the general elements. And that is conflicting with those who emphasize the importance of these local cultures. A third issue is a common language as opposed to translation. So when we are comparing different cultures, can we use a common language, or maybe even do we have to build a common language? Or can we simply translate the other language, but to what extent are languages translatable? And then in the sense of perfectly translatable, because to some extent they all are. The fourth is also linked to that. It's the so-called tertium comparationis, the question whether there is some neutral yardstick available for comparison, which we can use to avoid that we read other cultures, that we understand other cultures in our own terms and not understand it from the inside. So the idea of having some external element, external viewpoint, external yardstick is very attractive. We see that this is at the core of different papers, I would say, especially the one by Ralph Weber, who will say something about that, I guess, in a few minutes. The fifth issue is that the whole process of intercultural understanding mostly leads to a need for interdisciplinary research, because we need to have a broad view, for which we need historical, sociological, anthropological, etc. Elements. And that means that all the issues created by the interdisciplinary approach are added to the intercultural understanding issues. By this, we have a kind of double intercultural understanding issue, namely the cultures we are comparing, but also the cultures of the disciplines we are using. As we all know, that understanding each other in intercultural research is not obvious either. And then finally, a sixth issue that is especially present, well, is present also in many and increasingly in all disciplines, quantitative methods as opposed to qualitative methods. And the point is that if, most notably in economic research, when you want to compare economies worldwide, then that requires a large quantitative data. And that leads to the question to what extent such data are comparable. They are not collected in the same way. They are to be understood in a different context. And the risk here is that it leads to some acontextual interpretation, to, again, an overgeneralization of data, and criticized for that by those who are preferring qualitative methods. But qualitative research, on the other hand, is focusing on a much more limited area and is criticized as being too anecdotic and not suitable for more generally valid conclusions. So you see again this underlying idea of what a discipline is about or should be about, detecting general rules, general principles valid everywhere, or focusing on the local specific identity of some culture. Well, I cannot say more about it, but it's clear that all those issues remain challenges for most comparative disciplines and research projects in the humanities and social sciences in the future. And on this, Maurice will now say a few words. And after Maurice, Ralph Weber will say a few words. He also wrote a paper for the book. And then we have two speakers who were involved in the lecture series but did not write for the book. That's Greta Olson, who is professor at the University of Giessen, and Paula Giliker, who is a professor of comparative law at the University of Bristol. So we start with two lawyers, we end with one lawyer, but in between we have other disciplines involved, as Ralph Weber is a philosopher, and Greta Olson is in cultural studies. So there were, but now first Maurice Adams will say something. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Yes, all right, thank you very much. So thank you, Mark. And maybe I should briefly say something about the reason why I was keen on working on this project, which culminated in this book, except for being able to work with Mark together, whom I know now for, what is it, Mark? I think more than 30 years. He was once my supervisor of the PhD thesis. So, but in any event, my focus was a bit more on the reason for participating on this project was a bit more on teaching, because the project for me started in a sense quite some years ago, actually, having to teach a seminar on comparative legal research for master and PhD students at both Tilburg University in the Netherlands and Leuven University in Belgium. And while teaching that seminar, I developed a sense of unease, as it were, unease with a branch of scholarship in which much of the most influential work on comparative legal method, remains at the level of pure theory. So omitting really any sustained testing of its critiques and recommendations in practice. And it seemed actually as if there was a kind of anything goes attitude, and that was a phrase used in this context by the German-American scholar Matthias Reimann. Now, quite some legal scholars have indeed lamented what they understand as an identity crisis of the legal discipline in general, including the field that is also known as comparative law or comparative legal studies. And I think the situation is clearly changing. There is more and more attention for questions of method and methodology in recent years. So among academic lawyers, and certainly among academic comparative legal scholars. But the question remains, what can now be the way forward when when we are confronted with students who participate and sometimes are also obliged to participate in a class on comparative legal research or even comparative studies for that matter? So what are we teaching or telling them? When the only question they may have many times is how to do, dear lecturer, how to do hands-on comparative legal research. So what are we telling them if the literature involved for quite some of them, of these students, is too abstract, or in any event not necessarily very helpful with regard to their specific research projects? Well, not so much because it's either abstract or theoretical, but not so much because it lacks a translation to the actual practice of research. And now I have myself been working in the course I teach on combining research structure or design, if you like, with practice. So lots of examples from actual research, that is, combining that with theory. So structure and design combined with practice and theory. And I mean design in the sense of dissecting the different steps a comparatist seems to take when embarking on a research project. And in setting out these steps, providing lots of examples of actual comparative research and setting it off against the theories involved. Now, judging from the students' feedback, that approach helped quite some of them, which was important since they were dealing with, and interesting since they were dealing with quite different questions and accompanying approaches. So if you look at their approaches, it really included, for example, in using a broad context for explanatory questions, offering the big picture for understanding the compared items, as opposed to detailed research of isolated data. One compares at a micro level. It was also about large-scale quantitative comparisons competing with small-scale qualitative comparisons, and what have you. Now, seen from that perspective, the suggestion of Freiberger in this volume closely tunes in with my teaching experience. And it may well be one answer to the perceived identity crisis in virtually all comparative disciplines. So acknowledging, as he also did, that there is no comparative method as such, and not actually even within one and the same discipline, but that there is always a kind of comparative research design, which for quite some comparative scholars shows similarity, and which provides the structure in which more particular disciplinary methods considered appropriate for answering specific research methods can be fitted. Now, Freiberger himself, who has a background as a scholar of comparative religion, identified 5 operations that are potentially included in most comparative studies. So he called them selection, 1, 2, description and analysis, 3, juxtaposition, 4, redescription, and 5, rectification and theory formation. I will not go too deep into that at this moment. Read the book, please, but it is very helpful. So these 5 operations, or steps if you like, they provide a framework on which you can either structure a research project, build it up like on the line of these 5 operations or steps, or alternatively, it can help you, you can use it as an analytic tool or frame or of reference that helps you to situate your own project. So in terms of making you aware of what you are doing, which steps you are taking or not doing, and why you are not taking these steps. Now, in the course I teach, I identified some 8 or 9 steps, but the 5 steps presented by Freiberger can be identified within that more elaborate framework I used. In any event, looking at comparative research from the point of view of research design can, Mark and I think, open the field of research and certainly help our research students to think about their research project in terms of a structure and really also theoretically relevant practice. So this is just one example of how to proceed, and I'm sure that Ralf Weber, who actually suggested to bring in his colleague Freiberger in this project, thank you for that, Ralf. Ralf also contributed a very interesting and helpful chapter from the point of view of comparative philosophy, but certainly very insightful for all kinds of other disciplines too. Actually, we deliberately asked all the authors involved to build on the challenges they experienced when they were doing comparative research themselves. So in this sense, the book is theoretically and practically relevant, and that was very important for us. So Mark and I hope that it might make sense to further develop the field of comparative legal scholarship through this route. And we will certainly not hesitate to do that ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark and Maurice. I guess it's my turn now, right? Thank you for editing the book and for having invited me to London. I still have fond memories of the discussion that actually followed my presentation, and I learned a lot from it. I also learned a lot from it because it was a lot of comparative lawyers, and that I think is exactly what happened there, is also the purpose of the book, right? That you actually reach across disciplines and learn from what other disciplines have thought about comparison. And just, I think, because we emphasize that many disciplines face the same challenges, there's also the other side that some disciplines have just been specialists with some challenges. I'm thinking of theology, for instance, which is just wonderful to read when it is about the incomparability issue, right? Because there's something incomparable they're very concerned about, right? Or political scientists, right, who are very good in selection bias. And I think there's a lot to learn just from this exercise, and I really enjoy the book that came out of this. Now, I was somehow representing philosophy, which is a joy and a burden at the same time, right? Because philosophy is very broad, and I'm a philosopher, but I'm also a political scientist, and you will see that what I'll have to say is a bit of both. So I hope not just abstraction, but it will certainly end with a lot of abstraction, and I'm sorry about that in advance, right? But philosophy is an object where a lot of philosophers have written interesting comments about comparison. You could look at Wittgenstein for that, Immanuel Kant and others, right? And you find passages and paragraphs that are very interesting, but none of them, and that's my first point, right? None of them has written an entire monograph on comparison. They will all say that comparison is fundamental to concepts, to thinking itself, right? But none of them have devoted an entire monograph to the subject. So we lack that. We have no critique of comparison, right? Kant never wrote that. Now, what we have in philosophy is a subdiscipline, which is called comparative philosophy. And interestingly, despite the name, comparative philosophy, in my analysis at least, stands out for having a very leger way of going about comparing. So also there, you don't find a lot of sustained reflection about what it means to compare. That was a rather a surprise to me at the beginning of my endeavor. So what I want to do here are just 3 points, and then it's 3 points that I hope speak to a larger audience. The first one is about politics, indeed, because I think if you look at comparative philosophy, what the discipline has not done up to now is write its own history, right? We lack histories of comparative philosophy that would bring in background about why we compare what we compare, what in different times has motivated people to set out in comparison, right? 19th century is, I think, a starting point for many comparative subdisciplines, but it's also colonialism. And in comparative philosophy, you can actually quite nicely pinpoint the beginning of the term itself of comparative philosophy coming out of India as a reaction to colonialism, then spreading around France, later on the United States, right? And that's how the subject was formed. So there's a very concrete political background against which that enterprise starts off. Or you can then appreciate how after World War II in Hawaii, which became a center for comparative philosophy, it was very much about the Second World War, world peace, right? And philosophers like John Dewey tuned in, and you could sense the background of the politics of the day. And if one could continue like that for a long time, but that would bring us to the question, what motivates us today? What political conditions, right, are the conditions of possibility for doing political and comparative philosophy today? One point there, if we would look at the politics of comparative philosophy, one would be very quickly thrown back at interdisciplinarity. And indeed, I think the subject of comparative philosophy in recent years has gained a lot just by looking at other disciplines, largely anthropology, which has issued a lot of criticism on comparison. The comparative method has looked at entanglement, right? Different concepts have come up, which were challenges which I think are slowly, very slowly accepted in comparative philosophy. But also post-colonial, decolonial theory has really given the global dimension of comparative philosophy a new twist. So that's, I think, where the discipline connects with the book very nicely. The second main point that I want to make is about what is comparative philosophy about? The subdiscipline has been very ill-defined, very little defined. And that starts with the notion itself. If you look at comparative philosophy, it's unclear whether philosophy in that is the subject or the object of the inquiry. So whether it is about comparing philosophically or comparing philosophies is quite open. And practitioners have filled in that very differently. If it is about comparing philosophies, well then, you can include sociology again. You can do that in a sociological way, right? You can use another discipline to compare philosophies. And there again, we have another entry point for interdisciplinarity. When I say that people have filled it in very differently, then I should highlight that most people, as we also did already today, have turned to culture very quickly. So comparative philosophy often has been about comparing cultures, or has made culture the main marker of philosophical difference. Now, I personally argued often against that, right? But that's a discussion and a debate within the discipline. Other equally maybe valid markers of philosophical difference could be gender, could be class, a whole range of things, right? Could structure philosophical difference as much as culture does or does not structure it. My third point, and that's the one I want to talk about, longest than Mark already warned you about it. It will be about some abstraction, but it's a very basic, from some very basic points that I want to make. And I do think that they would apply for any endeavor of comparison in any discipline. So it's a strong claim that I want to make, but it also means it's quite abstract. But just a few propositions. When we compare, when there's a comparison, I think it's usually four elements that we highlight. Someone compares, so there's a person. The positionality of the person is hugely important, as I will show. Right? It also might mean that that person might do the comparison by thinking about being one's own culture, representing one's own culture, being on one side of the equation of the comparison, which has huge implications for the comparisons. So that someone is comparing. Someone is comparing two or more things. So the objects of comparison. Someone is comparing two or more objects of comparison in a certain respect. That's the already mentioned tertium comparationis, the third of comparison. And the outcome of that comparison, that's the fourth element, is usually a relation, like A is bigger than B, or whatever it is, right? Now that is what the standard definition of comparison sounds like. Now in my own work, I've tried to introduce a few distinctions, and I just want to relate them to you quickly. One is that I argue for a fifth variable in this very abstract way of thinking about comparison. And I call it a pre-comparative tertium. And that is the moment when the comparing person is choosing the objects of comparison by laying one thing next to the other. And that is what comparison means, right? The person actually has a choice what to compare. And that choice is not innocent, because that choice is driven by some understanding of a commonality between those two objects of comparison. So there's a respect in which you already have a commonality of what you set out to compare before you compare that in a certain respect. And I think it's hugely useful to distinguish those two respects. So the classic tertium comparationis and the pre-comparative tertium comparationis. The pre-comparative tertium will, for one thing, give you a realm of possibility in which respect to go on then to compare the two things that you compare, right? So if to give you an example, if I compare Christianity and Confucianism, but I compare them by understanding them as a religion, that's why I put one next to the other. It will give me a set of questions that then I will be likely to ask those, like the concept of God or whatever it is, right? Now, if I understand them as philosophies, I will have a different set of questions. So that's how the realm of possibility of certain respects in which then to compare them is really quite dependent on the reason why I put them next to each other. Now, I call that all the naked concept of comparison, naked comparison, because it's so abstract, right? So in later on, and that's what I discussed also in the chapter, I went into clothed comparison, because it's human beings, right, that compare in the end. And in the clothed conception, it also means that what you set out to compare is very likely not what you end up having compared. There's a distinction there. And I marked that in vocabulary by distinguishing between the comparanda, what I set out to compare, and the comparata, what I have ended up comparing. There's a huge process in between. So if there's no difference between the two, you really haven't compared, right? Then the inquiry has been empty. So there should usually be a difference, because you inquire, you want to learn something about what you compare. And that can be quite a telling exercise, because when you compare Christianity and Confucianism, by understanding them as religion, and you set out and you get into the subject matter, you might come to doubt whether Confucianism is best understood as a religion, is at all usefully understood as a religion. And then you don't quite know anymore what holds the two things together, other than you are interested in comparing them. So one commonality underlying a comparison at some certain point in time in your comparison can well be that there's no other commonality that you are being interested in the things that you compare. That's usually not how we would want to end up with a comparison, but in that process, it's theoretically an important point, because it shows that that commonality can be a purely external relation. Now, I probably will have to be short here, but I in that chapter, right, I talk about generalization, arguing that comparing always means generalizing. And how could it be otherwise? If you compare two singularities, set them next to each other, you generalize, right? You have to have some sort of a general approach that covers those two singularities. The other one is the sort of reproach, the comparison, and is often having a problem because one-sidedness comes in, bias comes in. And I argue that this is a confusion of the singularity of the one object of comparison with the tertium comparationis, which is an abstract point of view. There's some confusion in there. So I don't think that this is generally a problem in comparison. If it is, then it is the result of a misconceived comparison. Then a quick one, and that's an easy one, and it's a pedantic point, I should admit. We often say that we compare and the result are differences and similarities. I really don't think that that's what we do. I think it's commonalities and differences, or it's similarities and dissimilarities, but it's hardly ever differences and similarities. I think it's a notion that is widely used, but we should stop using it, in my understanding. The main point, and I will end with that, the main point that I think I bring out in the chapter, I want to argue for, has to do with the relational character of these comparisons. And I'll try to give an example about that again. If I take the ethics of Aristotle and of Confucius, and I want to compare that. Now I can think of the ethics that Aristotle put in his books, in all of his books. Maybe the one that he put in one of his books, maybe the one that he had in his head. I can particularize the ethics of Aristotle to a point where it is a singularity. I couldn't even talk about it anymore. It's so singular, right? And I think when I now use a tertium to compare for ethics in Confucianism, and I use that singularity, right? That would be a misconception. You cannot use a singularity to compare. You always use an abstract standard. What that means is that you're moving on a ladder of abstraction between particularity, very close to singularity maybe, and a very high level of abstraction. So understanding ethics being saying what's good and not good, something like that would be very abstract. And of course, then you have a lot of ethics in Confucianism. If I particularize a lot, of course, you don't have any ethics in Confucianism. It's very crucial to understand, I believe, at which level of abstraction one sets the comparison. And it has a direct consequence for what you end up with in your comparison is a similarity or a dissimilarity, is a commonality or a difference, whatever you want to argue. Often in practice, and I include myself in this, we are not very clear on the level of abstraction that we're using. If we're not clear, the result of our comparisons might as well be the opposite of what we're claiming, because it comes free floating whether you find a commonality or a difference. It must necessarily and is necessarily related back to an abstraction on that ladder of abstraction, a certain level there. And that is often something I think we, at our own peril, forget about talking. Now, this has been hugely abstract, I understand, and I'm sorry about it, but I'm sure with the discussion afterwards, maybe we can get into that. And if not, then the chapter hopefully has put it better than I was able orally. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ralph. Well, I think that the whole book is abstract because the topic methodology of comparative disciplines is unavoidably abstract anyway. Okay, then now I give the floor to Greta Olson, who has delivered a talk on in our lecture series, has some views on comparing, especially from her background of cultural studies, being American origin, but having worked for a long time at the German university. So I'm glad to have her again amongst us. So please, Greta, start your talk.
Welcome, everyone. And for those of you listening to us, I am, again, as we enter in the third long year of the pandemic, frustrated by this form of intercourse, the non-haptic interaction, not being together and looking at a screen full of faces, as I've been doing all day, and I'm afraid you have been doing as well. So I'm sorry I'm not seeing you physically. It's my pleasure to be here. I was honored to be in the lecture series. I was there in the beginning in 2017. I'm not going to say too much about comparative methods in cultural studies. I'd like to respond to your book. And I have 4 responses. The first is on method, what Ralph was just speaking about, and a consideration and a playing with the idea of the tertium comparationis, which you also deal with in the plural in the book in several places. And it strikes me, and there's always a problem of one's being in one's own hobby horse, but it struck me as a discussion that we've been having in metaphor theory and cognitive metaphor theory. And I'll say with this that in my own approaches to law, I take classical philological methods of looking at the metaphors and narratives and medial qualities of law and how law is communicated. And whereas in old-fashioned, old-school metaphor theory, we talked about ground and tenor, and the tertium comparationis, we now have gotten rid of that third element. And instead, we talk about how the comparison of 2 unlike things creates something new, a new cognitive domain. In the further advancing of metaphor theory, a blend. And this reminds me, of course, in post-colonial theory of Homo Baber's third space. So as a first reaction to your thinking about methods, which is important as a discipline matures, and as Maurice was talking about the need also for students, how do you actually do this? I was thinking about if you're creating a third space, a blend, in what you're doing in comparative legal studies. A second response to my reading of your text was the historical one that came up in so many of the pieces. And that was how legal comparison, implicitly already there was Savini from my own legal culture, has contradictorily and in different pieces stressed differences or similarities between legal systems and legal cultures, and that this has almost always been inevitably to political ends. And you bring up with this point, I thought, an important point for me with a cultural approach. Law is always political in how we understand it, is always cultural, and is always taking place within that. Within that, if we're stressing differences, as we are now more with discussions of legal pluralisms or similarities, when we want to talk about a common European legal culture, there's a discussion right now of does our, sorry, no longer with us, but does our continent legal culture, does the EU need a common narrative, for instance, to describe our legal culture, diverse and multiple at the same time? I found this historical variation between the emphasis on differences and similarities really quite interesting, and it's a theme that goes through the volume. With this is the move not only to human rights discourse, and I would argue that to a certain degree, human rights has displaced law as a framework. This is also something that you talk about in the book, but a move from legal transfers and legal transplants, arguably neo-colonial applications of a Eurocentric law, to one on legal translation and cultural translation, a topic that you take up with, criticize, and think about. I see this as moving parallel to movements within critical theory, critical cultural studies, to discussions of periphery and transfer in knowledge and knowledge creation, and more importantly and specifically to a non-monolithic understanding of legal cultures, that a legal culture is never one thing. It always is an overlap of cultures, cultural positions, and positions within this. So I saw, although it was not so explicit as a third point, the increasing interest in legal pluralisms in your book and in cultural approaches to law more generally. It's mentioned in the book, Lawrence Friedman's reintroduction of the term in 1969. And within that, Friedman doesn't talk about legal culture as one thing. He already is talking about external and internal legal cultures, actors, et cetera, and his term looks back to Eugen Ehrlich's Lebendes Recht, living law. But this brings me to another point, which is something, if I see this as an ongoing research project from your point, that you might wish to address more in the future, which is, it's, of course, law is not only state-centered or state-made law. It's also all forms of normativity. As Ehrlich was pointing out with his concept of living law, and which Friedman is also alluding to with law taking place in cultural realms. So to add to your deliberations, I would, from my own research, and I don't want to play my own drum, but just to say perhaps things to think about in your future research, seeing this as a project, would be, and this goes along with the idea of legal pluralisms, legal subjectivities, or what Legrand also talked about frequently in the volume calls legal mentalités. To think about within legal cultures and systems that individuals and cohorts have very, very variegated experiences of their legal orders. So to make this a little less abstract, I remain a US American citizen with a Aufenthaltstitel, permanent resident status in Germany. However, through the fact that I am a tenured academic and a civil servant, my living material experience of German legal order will be quite different from one of the many people seeking asylum in Germany right now. And this goes along with ideas, and I might have wished to have seen more of this in your deliberations, legal consciousness, mentalities, and awareness of how one's position within a legal order also determines one's experience of it as a different legal culture or legal order or legal environment. Within this, also with the idea of legal subjectivities, would come the increasing import of hashtag jurisprudence, social media, and the various ways non-legal actors understand law. Law, I would say, is indivisible from culture. Nonetheless, most of us are not legal actors, and most of us take in our knowledge of law through mass media, social media, leading to highly effective, all sorts of subjective attitudes about what law is. So in my own work, I call legality whatever people think of as law or as being lawful. What motored the UK's exit from the European Union, what I see in the Alternative for Germany slogans, freedom instead of Brussels, an identification with an imagined legal system or order, which we have people have very strong feelings about, as they do about their language, about their foods and other elements of their culture. So in an interest of further thinking about comparative law, because I have enjoyed your work so much, I would suggest taking in discussions of how people think about their legal systems and orders and cultures, Rechtsgefühle in German, or legal passions, legal affects, and the wider sense of legal pluralism of what people think of as law. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, the whole book is partly about that conflict between globalization and localization. The one is a reaction against the other one. People feel they lose their identity because of globalization, and they try to emphasize more local cultures. That's present in many of this comparative research too, to see that conflict. Yeah, I'm not repeating things, so I just want to thank you for your intervention. And of course, we all agree that it's a pity that we have to see each other on a screen and not in person. If in normal circumstances, you would have come to London, me too, as I'm not in London now, and we would have had a nice dinner after the event. And that is something where sometimes the most interesting discussions appear, and we miss that. Okay, but we all are optimistic and we don't think it will last forever. So we think that this summer it will be finished, but maybe we are wrong. Okay, well then the last member of the panel to say something about the book is Paula Giliker. So as I said, again, a comparative lawyer. So I'm looking forward to what Paula will have to tell us. You have the floor, Paula.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark and Maurice, for this excellent book. I've really enjoyed it. I've had the pleasure of reading an advanced copy. I also chaired some of the sessions that led to the work that resulted in the book, and very much enjoyed that. They were very, very interesting. And it's great to see so much scholarship out there and talking about, I think this is a really important topic, how we engage with our comparative research. And it's a book about comparative scholarship in its broader sense, actually trying to think about what we do and getting us to think about what we do. And two key words that stood out for me were the words understanding and reflection. Understanding the law, understanding the shape of our comparisons, thinking about it in advance and during the process, as we've discussed, but also trying to reflect on how we engage with that exercise. And this is something which, as someone who teaches comparative law, I try to teach my students, but I'm also very obvious that what we tell the students as professors, we need to practice it ourselves. And therefore it really pays, I think, to have a book like this that gets us to think about it, ask questions. And I think one of the things that stood out for me, which I want to talk about in this brief presentation, is more the questions that your authors have asked, myself, as well as the answers and the proposed answers that many of the papers give. So we're looking at the benefits of comparative methodology in law, but also trying to think by drawing broadly on areas of social sciences and humanities, what does comparing actually mean? What are we engaged in? And what methods could or should we use? So again, trying to, in a sense, have diversity in our armory to get us to think about how we can engage with this exercise of comparison. So we're looking to try and find a common language of comparisons. And I think you put it well in saying the challenge is how to understand the other, how to look at rules, societies, cultures in a very broad sense, and gain a greater understanding of that and the methodology we utilize to gain that. So it's a question of insights. And I think this is why it does pay reading very carefully as to how to do, and I think more importantly, perhaps, how not to do comparative law. So in a sense, to reassess how we engage with the exercises of our scholarship. And I want to pick up on 5 questions or insights, which I think might particularly interest the readers of this volume and get the readers to think about the exercises we are talking about. And one point that goes to the essays is, first of all, the difficulty of neutrality. The idea that when we're engaged in comparative scholarship, we have a neutral or objective perspective in which we can freely assess the different cultures with which we're engaging. And I'd mention here in particular Jeffrey Samuel's chapter, who talks about the ideological basis that we can perhaps smooth over, but actually does underlie a lot of the material we're dealing with. Also, Catherine Seidel, who says we need to challenge comparative's claim to objectivity or neutrality of methods and the criteria that we utilize, that we should not presume the universality of theoretical categories and concepts, but rather we need to think of the link with context and perspective. So again, challenging the materials, dealing with them more critically. The second insight I want to pick up on is this idea that when we're looking at research, what we need to think about is actually understanding the context. And it's not a question of identifying what are right or wrong answers, but actually that context is something we need to engage with and find methodologies of dealing with that in our research. Thirdly, we find a lot of warnings about what not to do, to avoid undue use of intuition, things we think we know, but perhaps what we think we know has an underlying contextual basis or even bias that we need to challenge within ourselves. Avoid superficial categorization, inappropriate decontextualization, one-sided focus either on similarities or differences. So again, in a sense, thinking about exercises we can easily slip into without realizing actually the difficulties that they raise and the danger of distorting the kind of results that we end up with. And again, one of the big warnings we see, and I've written here, tread carefully in relation to quantitative data. And David Nelkin's chapter here, I think, is excellent by saying so many organizations rely on quantitative data. And he cites the Corruption Perception Index and the World Bank. But to what extent have they thought about the challenges of engaging with quantitative data and how methodological choices could lead to failures to understand, distortion of results, a simplification of what is actually going on, and therefore undermining the exercise in question. And finally, what interested me in particular is the common problems. As comparative lawyers, We spend a lot of time talking about different approaches, thinking about how to deal with the comparative law exercise. But also, in a sense, it's comforting to see that other disciplines have similar issues. For example, legal historians, we are told, need to talk more about methodology. Religion scholars frequently speak of comparative method, but they seem to be more interested in the adjective comparative than the noun method. And again, a thought, I think, that crosses disciplines. And a final message, which we see coming from the chapter of Jean-Pascal Dalloz, he says that comparative exercise is ambitious. To be a comparative lawyer or scholar, you must be ambitious because it's far easier just to look at one system or jurisdiction or thought or philosophy. Actually engage with it comparatively is actually something that's ambitious and has possibility of great gains. But we do need to think about how we deal with it. And that requires humility. Humility to recognize that our framework may be flawed. We have lessons to be learned, that we need to think more deeply about how we engage in this exercise with which we do see great gains. And I think what this book tells us is that humility is necessary, but so is ambition. And what the book tries to do is help us reach our ambitions and produce better comparative scholarship. And on that basis, I'm very happy to say, welcome to this book. Please do read it. And I think you will find inspiration in there and further insights.
Thank you, Paula. I think now the floor is to Simon.
Mark, yes, thank you. I didn't know whether you wanted to add in a couple of comments yourself, but no, I've been given the opportunity to chair a brief discussion now. We have about 25 minutes left. So if those of you on the floor we're talking about metaphors, Greta, the digital floor want to post some questions, now's a good time to do so, and we can bring those into the discussion. So, I mean, this has all been incredibly fascinating. I mean, the book really opens up so many critical questions across the disciplines. And I say that from the point of view of the IHSS, which is ostensibly about trying to break down some of the paper walls, as we often say, between our disciplines, but also it's about recognizing the common challenges we often face. I think it's interesting that the discussion that we've had so far from the panelists, and thanks to all of you for your really interesting contributions, it sort of takes us through politics and almost ends us up, Paula, in ethics with your well-founded comment there about the humility required in doing this. And I guess that's my branching off point for the first question I wanted to put to some of you. Ralph, in your comments, you raised the very interesting question of, what does comparison presume? And I think that's absolutely the right question to do. Social science is profoundly interested in this question as well. To what extent then, as a follow-on question from that, and I put it to you, Ralph, first of all, but very happy to hear from the others as well, to what extent does comparison not just represent and reframe and perhaps alter the perception of the phenomena being compared, but to what extent can it actually change those phenomena? Let's take just one concrete example of race. Why does one compare across races? One does so for a variety of reasons and through a variety of different political vernaculars. But the effect of it is, in fact, ultimately to establish a language of discourse around race, which alters the relationship, the experience of different groups within those and across those categories. So is there a way in which comparison is, in that sense, and all of you unmask, in a sense, again, Ralph, to use your sort of closed metaphors, the innocence of comparison? And as I say, with respect to thinking through what an ethics of comparison is that might be applicable, and that I think the book raises all sorts of questions about, where do we begin to take that? And I do say, Greta, you also pointed out this is a discipline in the emergence and a journey that's just beginning. And so, as one moves down that path, what sorts of questions do we want to engage in around the ethical implications of the way in which we compare? Because clearly that's partly something you can control within disciplines and within a disciplinary language and set of rules and conventions, but it goes beyond the disciplines. It expands out via language and via cultural practices into society at large. And so, how does what we say and think and understand about the process of comparison as formal knowledge break out into the world as informal knowledge in ways that can really shape political and social outcomes?
Yeah, thank you so much. I probably would respond by emphasizing the difference between using comparison indeed as a research design, like a big comparison, right? Which I think there's a lot of good criticism around to do that, right? And I think there's good reason not to put up comparative inquiry as the big project. But needless whether that is the case or not, in the small, in every sentence, we introduce comparisons, right? Even if we compare what we think are unlike things, to know that these are unlike things is the result of a comparison, right? So at that mini level, so to say, this mechanical level, comparisons are all over the place. And that's what my comments were focusing on, like this almost like a logical operation of the mind, right? What we do when we compare. And this, I think, is almost a consensus among philosophers that is what you do when you, right? Comparison is essential for thinking in that regard. And now the distinctions that I put up, I think they have a special relevance for the question that you asked, right? About race and what do we do when we compare race. Now, if we would ask that question in the 18th, 19th century, right? I think it would be very important to understand that those sort of very rough variables that I put up. The comparer, why is that comparer putting one thing next to the other and then comparing that for the aspect of race, right? I think there would be, in hindsight, certainly a lot of questionable motivations for doing that from our point of view, right? But if somebody does that in today, they might have a quotational understanding of race, not using it in a biological sense, right? There would be a whole lot of different questions, but still the presuppositions that you put into a comparison, I think these rough variables, and they're very simple. If one answers them, if one analyzes a comparison that one sees lying in front of oneself, right, in a book that one reads, it is a good way to get at what somebody is actually claiming by comparing this or that. And so it's more a tool of analysis, I think, the way I think of it, than anything else. And in that sense, it gives us a critical tool to question comparisons, to understand what a comparison claims but does not substantiate, right? What the actual claim is that is substantiated, and so on and so forth. And I think for doing that, it's really imperative to get into this sort of mechanics, even if one thinks that there's other ways. But I also maybe also in little, maybe a response to Greta Olson also, right? I think there's a huge argument also that there's a more creative process of comparison, an understanding of comparison, a la Deleuze and Quantitative, right? This is about creating something new, which I have always struggled about putting that together with what I'm interested in, right? Because it almost seems like we use the same word for two very different things there, about creating something new, or this sort of more technical notion of comparison, right? But it's also, I mean, it's not to belittle that. I think that's what scholarly inquiry is very much about also. But it's almost like I have trouble finding the tertium between the two, to say it like that. Right.
That's great, Ralph. I mean, thinking of presupposition as well, and the ones that we take into the research design, and thinking through how we ourselves understand why we are comparing. I mean, it raises for me the questions, partly Greta, that you were talking to, but also Paula in your comments around, around fuzzy boundaries, around the notion of third space, around thinking of transit zones, and what that means for us who are trying to, perhaps artificially, is that going too far, to sort of set things up as distinct in order to be able to compare them more effectively? And does, again, what kind of epistemological violence does that do to those phenomena as we find them in the world to start with, and of course as we find them from very particular positions, as I think one of you mentioned? Don't know if any of you have any thoughts about that, and what we're doing when we compare. And just while one of you or other is thinking of coming in on that, noting some interesting questions coming in, which I will get to in a second. No response. I take that as you all agree. Okay, well, I've got another couple of points that I do want to try to bring out, because I think there was some interesting overlaps between some of the comments you were each making. But let me bring in now just a couple of questions from the floor, since we did say we would try to do this as well. a question here from Jeff Gilbert. I'm a scholar of comparative literature and cultural translation, and I've just thought the book. Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. What Jeff would like to hear you speak about, though, and again, whichever of you would like to come in on this, is about the use of translation theory in your work, perhaps elaborating on the passing comments about cultural translation. Maybe in relation to Assad is suggested here, but I could probably take that in a number of directions. So don't know if either of you want to bring in come in with a comment on the implications for cultural translation here. Greta, yeah, sorry, go for it.
Thanks so much. I didn't participate in the book, so I wish to give those who wrote pride of place in answering. But briefly, translational theory, unlike translation, has done away with the idea that there can be any complete translation, and being very comfortable with that, the non-translatability. And as applied to legal concepts and cultures, and that you have wonderful examples in your book that a structure or a concept will be taken from one, because legal culture is for me problematic, from one legal setting to another, and nonetheless used completely differently because the structures are different, or because localization, it's simply translated into that cultural difference. So the idea of translation theory, and there are many people, a German colleague of mine, Doris Bachmann-Meddick, it's about the non-translatability of culture and being comfortable with that and that dissonance, and then thinking about what that opens up.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And again, I don't know if any of you who were part of the book itself wanted to also comment on that. I mean, please do just come in. I mean, it links in a way partly to this broader question, and I guess it's one that you will have to have engaged with in thinking about this so far, which is about the status of different types of disciplines. I mean, you know, we have this, we know that this exists, and we know some of the reasons why, but this is a particular take on that problem, which is the status specifically of comparative disciplines. And, you know, historians of science have been very good on the different levels of scientific belief, if that's the right term to use, that come with different disciplinary approaches. You know, we have, I say we here, societies have certain faith and confidence in particular ways of doing it. And Paula, you were talking about quantitative approaches there, and the potential pitfalls that can be had within those. And of course, that features in one of the chapters as well. But I think this becomes pretty relevant, and we have a question here also from Miriam Hunter-Hernan, who says, you know, it's often presumed that comparative disciplines are insecure because of the methodological struggles of the sort that we've been describing. However, might the methodological struggles in comparative disciplines not be seen as a welcome sign of vitality, an attitude of self-reflection and self-revision, which actually avoids ossification? So there's some interesting questions here around what it takes to create innovation would be the wrong word, but self-reflection and critical progress in the level of thinking within a discipline that I think is quite relevant. So again, I don't know, Maurice or perhaps even or Mark want to pick up on that, because I think you probably have a particular take on it.
Well, no, just a very brief reply. There's this quote in one of the classic traditional handbooks on comparative law, which Miriam Hunter-Hernan must certainly know. That's the book by Zwager and Kutz, of course, an introduction to comparative law. Two German scholars, been translated since the late 19th, on top of my head, or even before, into English and spreading around the world. There are quite some problems with the theories they propose, but nevertheless, it's quite interesting. But there's a one-liner in there, on top of my head, where they say, they're quoting someone else, but where they say that disciplines or scholars who are discussing methodology too much are sick. These are signs of sick disciplines. So that's quite the opposite Miriam is actually saying in her question here, and I fundamentally disagree. I think it's quite the opposite. It might also be seen as a matter of growing up or becoming mature, if you like. And for me, especially thinking about methodology is very important for also students in law, the ones I'm dealing with, because it forces them to think about who they are as lawyers or scholars. It's reflection about your identity. Who am I as a disciplinary trained person? And what can I do with my knowledge? So that's for comparative research relevant, but it's also relevant in general about your position as a potential scholar or even a lawyer as such. What is the type of knowledge I have gained? How can I discuss things with that knowledge? In what terms is it relevant? So I think she's quite right with her comment. It might well be seen as a sign of vitality and self-reflection, as I just put it. Having said that, it took the lawyers, if we take the beginning of the discipline of comparative law, the beginning of the 20th century, as one usually does. It's older, but in any event, let's take that as a starting point. 1912 or 13, there was a big conference in Paris, which was usually referred to as the beginning of comparative law. It took us some 80 years to start thinking about method and methodology, and before we just did it, and sometimes quite well actually, but without any idea about how did we go about, why did we do it this way and not that way, comparing. So I think I take it as a gain that we are dealing nowadays more and more with method and methodology in a quite advanced way. I saw that Geoffrey Samuel was present also amongst the audience. Geoffrey wrote a chapter in the book, but he also wrote a monograph with Hart Publishing on comparative epistemology, comparative law epistemology, which is really quite advanced. And there are quite some other examples too. So we are becoming aware, and I think it's a sign of vitality more than anything else. So I really agree. I'm happy with her comment, and I really agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, and I'd go further. I mean, I think actually it's more than just vitality. I mean, I think it's about rigor, not least as well, and it's about. I mean, you know, you take the whole impact that decolonial scholarship is having a moment across the disciplines in different ways in terms of it also of sometimes specifically method, and that wouldn't happen unless you were being self-reflective and trying to revisit these questions of why we do certain sorts of things. And perhaps that's then the next question to move on to, which is, you know, what insights do we have from among you about the reasons and the different terms on which we compare? You know, do we fundamentally compare to understand others, or do we compare to understand ourselves? And do we need to distinguish? Is there anything to be gained by distinguishing between those two elements? I don't know, Mark, whether you have a view on that or any of the others.
Yeah,
but that strikes me as you know, fairly central to what we're trying to do here.
It's true. It appears from several papers in the book that I think especially of Peter van der Veer on legal anthropology, who says that, I think rightly, that the main advantage of comparing is to reflect on your own concepts, approaches, methods, etc. And of course, as an anthropologist, he's most faced with the problematic situation of comparing from your own framework and trying to grasp something completely different. But basically, it's the same problem everywhere. Like what Greta just said about translatability. Nothing is perfectly translatable. We see it, for instance, in comparative law. We see and we advise students to use the original concept, not trying to translate it, because you can have a concept which comes close to it, but it's not exactly the same, and then it's wrong. So reflecting on your own concepts and frameworks, I think it's even a sentence in my conclusion in the book that this is the main advantage of comparing.
And what about the the inverse of that? I mean, what about the disadvantages of bad comparisons, and what about the whole politics of bad comparisons? Again, it may be something that's less internal to the disciplines, though I well imagine that it does apply there too. But specifically in society, you were talking about sort of social media before, and perhaps here, Ralph, also it brings in some of these elements about the pre aspect that you're describing. You know, in different disciplines, neuroscience among them, you'd be talking about the kind of the cognitive biases involved in certain sorts of decisions, making comparisons in effect before you've even got there because of the way they've been ingrained. And of course, we're all familiar with this from unconscious bias training and so forth. But in that context, what do we have to say then to that whole element of call it knee-jerk responses? I mean, is a knee-jerk response a comparison of sorts? Where do we set the boundaries around what a comparison can be if we're pushing it in the direction of bad comparisons?
Well, of course, there are especially research supported by the World Bank showing that countries of the common law were better suited for economic development than those who belong to the civil law tradition. That has been severely criticized worldwide. It also is criticized in several papers in the book that you could call it a bad comparison, but you could also say there are no perfect comparisons. So there are always limits. I think there you point to something very important. If we are aware of our limits, and if we are aware of our own pre-understandings, we can warn the reader, and then nothing is wrong with what you write, because you know you are a European, a white European looking at Africa or Asia from with your own concepts, etc. If you warn the reader for that, okay, then they can nuance what you are writing. The problem is mainly that research results are offered as if it's the eternal truth. And that is wrong, indeed.
And I suppose in turn, then that raises the question of different types of comparison. Whether a numerical comparison is being made and what lies behind that in actual fact, or whether we are drawing out statistical inferences. Again, mentioned the World Bank, Mark. I mean, there's quite a lot of fairly infamous large-scale global databases that make comparisons of a certain sort, which present, and I think Paula, you picked up partly on this too, a certain statistical objectivity, but of course those phenomena and observations and claims that are made on those bases are themselves no better than the presumptions that go into the models or that go into the other ways of comparing. And I guess there are multiple forms of comparison, but they are in a sense all informed in different ways by some of the specific observations about comparison that you're each making. And I think for me, this is one of the things I find most fascinating about the book is that there is a domain here of knowledge that we're kind of extracting that can be applied in a variety of different ways and across a variety of different disciplines. So talking about different disciplines, perhaps then that's the appropriate moment to segue into a comment here from a question from Jeffrey Samuel, bringing in that gargantuan interdisciplinarian Terry Eagleson, who says in his book, Jeffrey tells us, or reminds us rather, on literary theory, the economist J.M. Keynes once remarked that those economists who disliked theory or claimed to get along without it were simply in the grip of an older theory. Perhaps much the same could be said about methodology. I think I might agree with that. I don't know if any of the panelists would agree or dare to disagree with Professor Eagleton or Professor Keynes, or indeed with Jeffrey. Do you have any thoughts on that matter of really? I guess this is back to the historical read on where thinking about comparison lies within kind of methodological debates.
I might have something to say on this, right?
Yeah, please.
I believe if one is not concerned about method and methodology today, it doesn't mean that one doesn't use a method. It just means that one doesn't know which method one is using. And that's a bad starting point in order to do critical science, right? There's no way how you don't have a method, but there's a lot of ways you can't know about the method that you're using. And that I think is reason enough for me to want to know more about method. And comparison in that sense is fundamental. I can only repeat that, right? And it's so fundamental that I think up to today, I haven't found a reasonable argument for incomparability, right? Incomparability only makes sense if you have a lot of background assumptions. That's why for theology, it's a very important concept. But the incomparability that theologians talk about is not an incomparability that they want to argue for. It's one they want to presuppose with good reason from their point of view, right? But to argue for incomparability, whatever you argue is incomparable is the result of a comparison. And you can be aware of that or not, right? So in that sense, I think comparison is just fundamental, even if you might have good reason not to want to put emphasis on comparison as such. But there's just no way around it in my view. That's why I'm also open for all sort of more progressive views on comparison. And there's a lot, I mean, from Joshua Agamben or Homi Bhabha we've named, right? There's a lot of more progressive views on comparisons. But in the end, I think you could show how those approaches at some point rely on comparison again, but they don't want to emphasize it for good reason. And that's fair, but it's not that you can do away with it. And I would argue you can't do away with a tertium, but that's a contested view probably today. But I haven't found an argument that makes sense to me, right? Where you could dispose of that very basic, fundamental operation of reason that is just there. And that's why I think, just one final sentence on this, right? I do think that comparison might not be the most fashionable thing to it, but one should throw out the baby with the bathwater. But when criticizing comparison, it just means to have a more emancipated view on comparison. I think it doesn't mean to get rid of it. And that, I think, would make for better theoretical approaches, entanglement and border zones. You named some of them, right? Contact zones. And that would be the corrective that I would want to see translated into practice, so to say.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ralph, as you said. I'm just thinking of the sort of the normative overtones of the term incomparable, and the context in which one would use that term. And I think there's definitely a lot in what you're saying there. We're almost, unfortunately, at the end of our allotted time. Let me just offer any of the panelists a last chance for a final closing comment, if there's one they wish to make. Please, Greta.
From the off, lovely to be here, and I want to second Paula in thanking you for this book. I also see the struggle with methods as a sign of that disciplinary self-consciousness as a sign of maturity and also struggling forward. And thank you for those of us also working on comparisons in other fields for your work.
Thank you, Greta. Paula, Mark, or Maurice, anything last?
Again, to reiterate what Miriam said, I think one of the strengths I've seen in comparative law methodology in recent years is, rather than just defending, say, functionalism, actually engaging in looking at new disciplines, like an interdisciplinary approach, actually broadening our awareness of different approaches. And I think that's really important. It's what makes it so dynamic. And again, to welcome this publication, because again, it's promoting a dynamic view of comparative scholarship rather than one that just rests on its laurels and defends what we already have.
Indeed. Let me then just add my voice to the chorus of those thanking you for the publication, because I think it really does bring the debate forward and makes a contribution, as I say, across the disciplines. So Mark and Maurice, thank you for making this happen and for seeing it through. Projects, as we all know, particularly over the last few years, have not been the easiest to complete. So congratulations on that, and I strongly recommend the book to those of you in the audience who've not yet had a chance to look at it. With that, let me just extend my thanks from and on behalf of the IHSS to all of you for your time today, our panelists, Greta, Ralph, Paula, Mark, and Maurice. Really do appreciate your time and your insights. And to those of you in the audience, for your time as well. And just to say, as Jolanta has put in the chat now, you can find, and we'll be able to find very shortly, this this event on our website, where you can either share it with colleagues who weren't able to make it, or review parts for yourself. So thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of evening, and look forward to seeing you all back here for a future event at the IHSS. So it's best wishes from us.